Welcome and thank you for joining us for another episode of Studio 901. I'm your host, Kiana Faircloth. You should be familiar by now what Studio 901 is, but if this is your first time watching the show, I want to let you know that this is DCTV's greatest exploration of the art that is among us. On Studio 901, we will spotlight local, emerging, and established artists that are creating right here in the DMV. With us, you'll discover some of the area's greatest treasures, some of our best-kept secrets, and hear some never-before-told stories about living the creative life. Joining me today on Studio 901 is one local spoken word artist that is making moves in the area, Gowri K. Gowri K is a Tamil-American poet, performing artist, teaching artist, and lawyer whose parents immigrated from Sri Lanka. Her advocacy has addressed animal welfare, the environment, the rights of prisoners and the criminally accused, and justice and accountability in post-war Sri Lanka. She is co-author of 2 peer-reviewed scientific journal articles on the environmental impacts of factory farming, and her poetry has been published in Beltway Poetry Quarterly, Burgeon, and Lantern Review. Gowri was a member of the 2010 DC Southern Fried Slam team and has performed at Lincoln Center Outdoors, the Kennedy Center's Millennium Stage, Atlas Performing Arts Center, Capitol Fringe Festival, and Smithsonian Folklife Festival. With Palestinian composer and musician Huda Asfour, she also co-produced and performed in Yasmin at the 2014 Atlas Intersections Festival. She serves as poetry coordinator at Bloom Bars, a poetry events host at Busboys and Poets, and senior poetry editor at Jaggery, a Desi-Lit arts literature journal. In May 2015, she was named co-author of Beltway Poetry Quarterly. Welcome to Studio 901, Gowri K.
Thanks for having me, Kiana.
Absolutely. Now, at Studio 901, we always ask our guests 2 questions right off the bat. First off, what age did you first start writing?
I think I first started writing in middle school at some point, so I was probably about 11 or 12.
Wow. So what are some of your inspirations for your poetry, for your writing, whether it be other writers or life events? What has inspired you to write?
I think a lot of what inspires me to write is, the injustice, passion, the things that I am passionate about in terms of social justice issues. Some of my writing is autobiographical. In fact, it is largely autobiographical, but oftentimes commenting on various issues of concern to me, or others. I suppose I do write some, life event type poems as well. Those don't tend to be the ones that I, like personal ones that I share as much. And then in the past couple of years, I've gotten really into writing haiku. And so that is what I do across social media is haiku.
Now break down, haiku usually is what, 6 lines
So
or so?
Haiku, I specify and say that I write contemporary English language haiku.
Okay.
So it's sort of like the most basic way of writing a haiku. 3-line poems.
3 lines.
And they go by a syllable count. So you have 5 syllables, 7 syllables, 5 syllables. And I started getting really into haiku as an open mic host. It was something that I found myself doing while hosting open mics as a way to keep the show fun, keep it moving, share some poetry, and then it just sort of grew, and now it's, like I say, how I communicate across social media. And so my haiku tend to be about anything and everything that's going on.
Whatever's happening?
Yeah.
Okay, give us an example.
Okay, well, I'll have to pull out an old one because those are the ones I know better. I have a lot of haiku about race and racism.
Very appropriate.
One of my favorites is, not to sound racist, but what I'm about to say is likely racist. Which is how I feel when people preface anything with not to sound racist. Yeah, I have another one that's just like a little snapshot of something that happened with my niece years ago. I found what I was looking for. Brown faces. My niece flipping channels.
Wow, that is so cute. How old was she?
She'd say the darndest things. She was 3 years old at the time. and she was playing with the TV, and there were a bunch of us sitting around, and she didn't usually go to the TV, and she was playing with it, and I heard her say, "I found what I was looking for," and I looked, and it was the Bernie Mac show, and she's a 3-year-old, and I started laughing, and I said, "Oh, really? You were looking for the Bernie Mac show?" And she just looked at me, and she said, "No, brown faces."
Yes.
Kids do say the darndest things.
They sure do.
They say some real stuff.
All right. What was the first sort of incidents in your life that inspired you to want to put it to paper and write?
I can't really remember, but knowing that I did start writing in middle school, you know, and the emotions and the way we experience our emotions
That's an odd time for a kid, you know?
Oh, totally.
It was for me.
Totally. So I think at that time, you know, the poetry I was writing, it was, you know, the same way that some people keep a journal to just sort of work through their feelings or work through what they're going through in life. I would sit and write poems, and they weren't things that I really was sharing with anyone back then. It probably wasn't until high school and then in college that I really started sharing my work.
Yeah, I was going to ask what gave you the courage to step out and share your poetry with the public.
You know, I was just talking about this with someone the other day because we were talking about how surprised we were the first time we got on a stage to share our own poetry, because we both had a similar experience. I grew up doing, you know, singing in public, you know, chorus, solos, doing theater, doing dance, so I was very comfortable getting up on stage and performing in front of strangers. And I never really dealt with stage fright or anything like that. Then in college, that was the first time that I got up in front of people, strangers, and read some of my own poetry. And I did the poems, but I blacked out.
Yeah.
You know, I was on stage, I read my poems off paper, I sat down next to my friend and I said, "What just happened?"
Yeah.
And she said, "You looked really nervous, but you know, you did it." And I said, because it was like my brain went blank and I was
Yeah.
on some autopilot. And I was just shocked because I had no idea that it would feel so different to get up on stage and not be reading someone else's lines or singing a song, but really sharing something that, you know, is personal and you put so much of yourself into it. So I had that experience years ago, and it was informative, definitely.
Well, let's get into a little bit of your writing process. Now, do you sit and think through every word of every stanza that you write, or how does it flow for you? Is it free-flowing? Tell us about your process.
I would say my process tends to be to start with free writing. And when I start with free writing and, you know, trying to keep it as you know, keep the pen moving as much as possible, sometimes I have some idea of the piece that I want to write. You know, oh God, I really want to write a piece about X or about this thing that just happened. Other times it's just a matter of, you know, like, it's a practice, right? It's like anything else. So just doing it for the sake of doing it and just saying, I'm just going to sit for 10 minutes and write whatever comes out. And it doesn't have to be anything great, but who knows? Sometimes you find little seeds to a poem that way. So I tend to start that way. And then once I decide that a piece is something that I really want to work on and take somewhere, it's just, you know, editing over and over and you know, sometimes also workshopping it with other writers as well.
Do you find yourself writing every day?
God, I wish I could say yes, especially sitting here right now on this show. But no, I don't. And, you know, I think it's a challenge. And it's something that you know, people talk about writer's block, and I learned years ago not to use that as an excuse, because writer's block is also a choice, not to pick up your pen and just sit down and write something. So my little cheating way of saying that I do write every day is that I definitely write at least one haiku every day.
Okay.
At least one. But longer form poems, not every day.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, when we return, we'll talk to Gowri K on how she balances her creative life with her professional life, or do they mix with each other? So stay close. We'll be right back. This is Studio 901.
And I can't change, even if I tried, even if I wanted to. My love, my love, my love.
We are neighbors and best friends.
I love my sister.
My heart doesn't see race. Love is love.
Our family is no less than any other family.
Love is kind. Love is patient.
In your new role, we help you help. Visit aarp.org/caregiving for information on how to provide even better care for the person who once took care of you.
Welcome back to Studio 901. I'm chatting with poet Gowri K. Now, Gowri, how do you balance your professional work life as a lawyer with your creative life as a poet?
Well, I actually think of all of it as my professional life. I don't have a law type job where I'm working full time in law and then have to find pockets of places to do the creative work. It's really more so doing everything in bits and pieces, and kind of it turns into a composite, you know, like a puzzle of professional life. But at the same time, it's interesting to me to see how sometimes the legal work can influence my creative work. And the reverse is probably also true. But I've definitely had experiences where I've been sitting in the middle of, you know, some sort of session or meeting where, you know, it's tons of people and I'm just sitting there to listen and take notes and that sort of thing about a legal issue, about something, you know, relating to human rights or something. And it will inspire a poem. And I think that part of that is just the principle of being creative, and this idea that we tend to be very creative and have very creative moments when we're distracted or when we're not focusing on that thing. Like we were saying, you know, I might sit down and say, I really want to write this poem about this thing. Now write it. And that might be a lot harder than just having that in mind and thinking about it and turning it over for a couple days, and then who knows where that inspiration will strike. So I do find that happens sometimes.
You know, that's a great segue into my next question, which is, what does it mean to you to be creative? And how do you exactly create? How do you do it?
I think of creativity as being really, really broad. I think of artistry as being really broad. And I'm someone who will say to people, you know, what kind of artist are you? And they'll say, I'm not an artist. And I'll be like, no, you are. You just haven't decided or discovered what your thing is. So as far as creativity goes, you know, I find, like when I come and see someone has, you know, arranged flowers like that, that's a type of creativity I fully lack. Anything dealing with visual artistry, you know, I think that's creative. I think, you know, making a really beautiful meal can be very creative, right? I think sometimes the way that we engage with people in conversation, when we allow ourselves to push our own boundaries a little bit, that can be creative. But in terms of my work as a poet, I feel creative when I feel like I've found a way to talk about something or to say something in a way that, you know, I'm not going to say it's never been done before, because I don't know everything that's been done before, but in a way that feels authentic and feels like I'm getting past just talking about something and kind of talking through it.
Yes, and do you find that your work oftentimes becomes a conversation because of the things that you've chosen to focus on with your poetry? Do people come up to you and want to then have a conversation about what you've just shared?
Absolutely, and I think that that is something that we find a lot in the spoken word community, in like the open mic poetry scene, and I love that about it. I love that you can get on stage. For one thing, I love that you can get on stage and share some stuff that maybe you don't even talk about with your friends or your family, and yet we feel this comfort getting up, potentially in front of strangers and sharing this stuff because it's poetry and because that is how we're presenting it. But absolutely, I think that poems are absolutely a way that dialogue can start. And I've definitely had the experience you were just talking about, where you have a conversation with someone after a show and you can actually talk about substantial stuff because you've already put out a bunch of information, you know.
World hunger together.
Start,
through
plant
poetry.
plant seeds. But yeah, I think art is a great way to start dialogue, and that's one of the ways I think it does.
Yeah. Now, on that same vein, what are you trying to communicate with your poetry? Do you have a particular purpose that you're trying to express, or something that what is your purpose for writing?
I think, you know, there are a couple of aspects to it. I think one thing is wanting to talk about issues and experiences in my poetry that maybe aren't things that we hear a lot about. Such as war in Sri Lanka, you know, or, you know, I mean, I don't have a poem like this, but like street harassment, sexual harassment, like those are some of the poems that I love hearing from people. Things that maybe we don't talk about them enough, maybe we do talk about them, but not in a way where we're really hearing from lots of different voices. And so I think poetry can be a great way to do that and to say, what are some things that I would like to spotlight that I wish got more attention in the world? And I think another reason I enjoy doing what I do is for the fact of representation. I think about that in terms of, you know, when I was growing up, we didn't really have any like famous South Asian Americans to look to or to see that, you know, we could be actors and we could be directors and we could be this. And now it's exciting to see that, like, my nieces and nephews, they can see that. They can see their own faces reflected somewhere in arts, in entertainment and whatnot. And so in the same way, you know, I think it's quite lovely when I do a show or do something and have, you know, young South Asian women come up to me and talk about, you know, getting involved in doing something like that, or how they also write, but they haven't yet done this. And yeah, so I think that that's important as well. Having as diverse an array of artists and voices out there sharing our stories and sharing different narratives.
Now, what's your favorite piece that you've ever created? What was it about?
Oh, my favorite piece. I've gotten this question before, and I think I said the same thing. It is a poem called Emergency Broadcasting System. It was a poem I wrote when the decades-long civil war in Sri Lanka was coming to an end, and just really horrible, horrible things were happening. And it was a rare time that we were hearing about it more in the international news, because this war that had been going on for so long, you know, a lot was happening at that time. So it's, you know, it's a painful poem, it's an ugly poem, it's about horrible things, but it's my favorite poem in one sense because it is the only poem I've ever written that I consider a documentary poem. Because everything in there, I usually say before I perform it, the only creativity in this piece is the way that I, you know, put the words together and organized it. All of the imagery is actually factual, and it's from news reports, and it's from testimony in Congress, and it's from, you know, Human Rights Watch and other major human rights organizations. And so a lot of work went into it, and a lot of, you know, concern went into it. I was very, again, when we talk about representation, this is something that I knew a lot of people don't know anything about, and now I'm going to be getting up and doing it at slams and open mics, and it might be the only time people hear anything about Sri Lanka. But it is also my favorite poem because of how much I've seen it have an impact on people, be they people who didn't know anything about the situation, who are so moved when they, you know, I think for a lot of us, we know about so much that goes on in the world that's awful and unjust, but we don't necessarily know about every situation. So our hearts are open if we get the information. And so I've seen that, and then also seeing, you know, people who actually do know a lot about it and have lived through some of what I talk about, and seeing their appreciation at hearing someone voice these things and voice them in the form of poetry.
Now, it sounds like it's become a signature piece, and of course now I'm intrigued. Can you give us a little bit of a soundbite of that poem?
Hello. My name is Heartache. My young cousins in the north learned to play war instead of house, could identify which bombs would drop based on the whir of plane engines. And even my mother, after being trapped for months, but then safely tucked back into America, would startle at the sound of our neighbor's lawnmower running inside for cover.
That's deep. That's deep. That's all I can say is that's deep. I can't even imagine, being startled by a lawnmower.
Yeah.
And the fact that can do that to someone.
And then
wow,
as your
says a
children
lot.
to see your mother, I mean, we're standing in the front yard talking,
Yeah.
and all of a sudden the neighbor starts running his lawnmower, and she just books inside the house.
Wow. When we come back, we'll talk to Gowri K about some of the challenges of being a poet in DC and what's next for her. Stay right there. This is Studio 901.
I'm Drew Brees, and being a dad means the world to me. And one of the most important things any parent can do is make sure their kids get active at least 60 minutes each day. Studies show that physical activity not only helps kids stay healthy, it can enhance important skills like concentration and problem solving, which can improve academic performance. This means physical activity can help your kids in the most important game of all, life.
Welcome back to Studio 901. I'm Kiana Faircloth, your host, and I'm here with poet Gowri K. Now, Gowri, have you faced any challenges being a poet in the DMV, and how have you overcome those challenges?
I don't know that any challenges I would say I've faced are unique to being a poet in DC or even being in DC. I think of it as challenges of being an artist. But one thing that thankfully, when I got into the art scene in DC, I quickly met people who had been involved for a long time, and people who, there are some really wonderful people out there who will provide you with some guidance and advice if they see that you might need it. And I remember early on hearing this from a couple of folks, the idea that our art is labor and our art is work, and we don't have to just when we're asked to do a performance or do a show or, edit a thing or whatever, as much as we might be excited to do it because we are an artist, we should value our own labor, and we shouldn't be embarrassed to ask to be paid for our work like anyone. And that was a lesson that I had to actually learn starting out, and I certainly wasn't the only one. And then that was something that it also, I'm probably still getting comfortable with that. It's not unusual to get a request from someone asking you to curate an event for them or do a performance or host a fundraiser or whatever. And it's important to me to donate my services in ways that I can, but it's also important to me to not donate everything that I do at all times. So that was a challenge. Know your worth, right? Know your worth, exactly, and know that what we do as artists is work, and it is it's labor, and it should be valued in that way as well as in other ways. But I would say overall my experience as an artist in DC was really, really fortunate in the sense that I found early on, my experience was as long as I went to events and met people and shared my work, there were people who were there to be mentors and to help newer people kind of, find their way and find their footing and learn more about the scene than they may know. And so I try and do the same thing for folks as well.
You are a mentor to
I think
many
it's
now.
important to do that.
Now, I want to change gears for a minute before we wrap up and ask, does the internet and social media contribute to the well-being of your poetry and just poetry in general? I know you mentioned earlier that you do the haiku on Twitter. We'll talk about the impact of social media on your writing.
It's interesting. I think I mentioned earlier, I started doing what I call on-the-spot haiku while hosting open mics, and I still do them when I host open mics. Then when I joined Twitter, because of the character limit on Twitter, I thought, exactly. So I thought, wouldn't that be great to try and do tweets as haiku? And pretty much everything I tweet about, it's usually, a link to some news article or commenting on something that's going on, and so I force myself to write haiku for all of that. And I just joined Instagram last month or 2 months ago, and so I post photos and videos, but I write haiku about them as well.
I'm sure that keeps you on your toes, though, when you got to constantly be thinking.
It does. It really does. And it's really interesting because it makes you think, because you're thinking in terms of syllables, but then it makes you think in terms of, okay, I got to think of another word for that. What's another way I could say this whole thing?
You're like a walking thesaurus.
But So certainly that, that's a lot of what I do on social media, but I found social media also really beneficial just in terms of videos that are up on YouTube, for example, of me doing, performances wherever. And they're not videos I put up, they're videos that other people have put up. But I have met people that way from around the world.
Wow.
I've ended up with like engagements in other places because someone stumbled upon a YouTube video and then started looking me up and started, looking at more of my work. And that's the kind of thing, with YouTube and Twitter and Instagram and even
it
Facebook.
Sort of makes our world a little smaller, which is a good
Absolutely,
thing for artists.
absolutely. And I think that it would be very different if the only way that my work was getting out was through me physically showing up at places, essentially.
You can't be everywhere at all
Can't
times.
be everywhere at all times.
So it helps. Now, do you have anything coming up that folks can look forward to from you creatively?
I wish I had a show I could promote right now. I don't have one of those to promote, but I would say I'm hosting open mics all the time. I love to tell people about Bloom Bars, which
tell
has
us.
been one of my homes now for years. Bloom Bars is a nonprofit community arts organization in Columbia Heights on 11th Street. And we do all ages programming. Everything's run by volunteers. Everything's done by donation. And so every Monday night we have an all ages open mic, a variety open mic. And so I've been hosting that for years. So you can come see me any Monday night there, have fun, hear some haiku. I also host a Busboys and Poets every fourth Tuesday of the month. And then in terms of larger work, last March, I did an original show with a Palestinian musician and composer, Huda Asfour. Our show was called Yasmin, and it was our first time doing the show. We did it at the Atlas Intersections Festival at Atlas Performing Arts Center. So she's been out of DC for a while. She's recently returned, and so we're now slowly working on version 2 of Yasmin. So that's something to keep an eye out for.
Looking forward to that.
Yeah.
We'll be right back. This is Studio 901.
Thank you, dear. Well, you're very supple. It's like I was at your age. Back then, I was a sex expert. Used to call me the buttered biscuit. I know about birth control, too. So you can ask me anything, baby.
Bedsider.org has birth control information and a lot more. And it's...
Have you had sex in this car yet?
Thank you for tuning in to Studio 901. It's been a joy sitting down and talking with Gowri K. She is someone you should definitely check out at your local spoken word venue. Remember, Studio 901 spotlights emerging artists from all over the DMV that are creating and performing right here in our own backyard. If you want to find out more about what you saw today, just hit us up on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook at YourDCTV, or visit our website at dctv.org. Before you leave, I want to leave you with this quote from Russian French painter Marc Chagall. Art must be an expression of love, or it is nothing. Join us for another episode of Studio 901, where we just might spotlight you. I'm Kiana Faircloth. Until next time.